Section 1 of The Age of Anne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Nagami, M.D. The Age of Anne by Edward Ellis Morris. Chapter 1. The Spanish Succession. In the last years of the 17th century, the minds of all European statesmen were turned towards Spain. Spain had once been the most formidable of monarchies, dangerous to the peace of Europe. As far as this formidableness depended on material resources and the extent of territories, there was no reason why she should not be so again. In the reign of the Emperor Charles V, who was also known as Charles I of Spain, the Spanish king ruled not only over Spain but over the rich provinces of the Netherlands, over large districts of Italy, and over undefined territories in America rich in silver mines. It is true that from his son Philip II, husband of our Queen Mary, the provinces of the Netherlands revolted, excited by his malignant hostility against the Protestants. Some were successful in their revolt, and formed the country which, released from the Spanish yoke, had since prospered under the name of the United Provinces, or Holland. Portugal also, which Philip had seized, had again established itself as a separate kingdom. France had wrested 3 provinces from Spain, but the greater part of the dominions of King Philip were still joined together. Spain and the Netherlands, Italy and the Indies, and the crown of this ill-assorted monarchy was upon the head of Charles II. As long as he should continue to live, no anxiety would be excited in the mind of any statesman. In mind and body he was perhaps the feeblest man in his dominion. In infancy it had been doubtful whether he could be reared. Ever since he had been an invalid. He suffered from a malformation of his jaw which prevented the mastication of his food. He was terribly ignorant, and as superstitious as he was ignorant. The kingdom of Spain had been misgoverned before, but in his time it was going to ruin. Every department of the state was in disorder, the law courts, the army, the finances. As long as he could be kept alive, no foreign statesman would feel in the least afraid of Spanish ambition. But his death was imminent, and great uneasiness was felt as to the succession to his crown. Charles was childless. The crown would therefore devolve upon the descendants either of one of his sisters or of his aunt. Their respective claims will be best explained by a reference to the accompanying table. According to the ordinary rules of inheritance, the Dauphin, as son of his eldest sister, had the best right. But Louis XIV and Maria Theresa had on their marriage renounced for their posterity all claims to the succession, and ratified this renunciation with the most solemn oaths. On the marriage of Leopold the Emperor to her sister, a similar renunciation had been made, though according to the notions of the day the oaths were less sacred, and the agreement was regarded as less binding. The issue of this marriage was a daughter, who had married the Elector of Bavaria. Her claim would pass to her son Joseph, the Electoral Prince of Bavaria. The third claimant was the Emperor himself, the cousin of King Charles. His claim was the weakest by descent, but the strongest in that at his mother's marriage no renunciation had been effected. The King of France and the Emperor were fully aware that an absolute union of the Spanish crown either with that of France or with the Empire would never be permitted. The Dauphin, therefore, and the Emperor agreed each to waive his right in favour of his second son. The 3 claimants stood forth as Philip, Duke of Anjou, Joseph, the Electoral Prince, and the Archduke Charles. It was manifest that it would be best for the peace of Europe that the crown should pass to some prince of small power, or one whose power was distant from Spain. Anxiety was especially felt lest it should fall to a French prince, for France was now occupying the position in Europe once held by Spain, and the prospect of a union of the two countries under princes of the same family caused a genuine alarm, especially among Protestant statesmen. Louis XIV. Is called in history the Great King. He was the founder of that policy of aggrandizement of France at the expense of her neighbours which has marked French history since. Earlier French statesmen and French kings had the notion of an equilibrium in European politics, France being one amongst equal states. But Louis wished to give her supremacy. Owing to her wise interference on behalf of toleration in Germany, in the great 30 Years' War, France had, about the time of the accession of Louis, attained very considerable power. By unscrupulous encroachments, by interfering in the affairs of Germany, weakened as she was by her long struggle, and by vigorous fighting under most skilful generals, Louis had increased that power. There was indeed reason to fear for the liberties of Europe if Spain were joined to France, nor was there room for doubt that this power would be hostile to the cause of Protestantism. The wise toleration which Henry of Navarre had granted to the Huguenots by the Edict of Nantes had been cancelled by the revocation of that charter. The influence of the Jesuits was plainly visible in the French court. Louis had one great opponent, William of Orange. His ancestor, William the Silent, had opposed Philip of Spain, whose power was dangerous to Europe and to Protestantism, and young William devoted his life to the same cause, the defence of the liberties of Europe, especially in religion. At first he stood forward only as the ruler of Holland, but when the Revolution placed him on the throne of England, that country, which under Charles II. Had been but the vassal, the paid servant of France, resumed her rightful position at the head of the Protestant cause. It is not necessary here to recapitulate the different events that mark stages in the contest between William and Louis. The last tedious war, in which England had for the most part been successful at sea and France on land, was ended with the Treaty of Ryswick, which, whilst it acquiesced in many of Louis's conquests, yet settled the Jacobite question. Louis had undertaken to recognize William as King of England, and never more to assist the exiled James in his attempts to regain the crown. The peace was eagerly welcomed. England and France alike were tired of war, and the rulers of the two countries, reluctant that the peace of Europe should be disturbed by this new question with respect to the succession to the crown of Spain, desired to arrange it without fighting. The negotiations between William and Louis upon this subject were long and anxious. They began when Bentinck, Duke of Portland, once William's greatest friend, and still one of his most trusted advisers, was sent on an embassy to Versailles. They continued when Tallard, a distinguished French nobleman and general, was sent by Louis on a special embassy to England. They were brought to a point at Loo, William's favourite Dutch palace, to which, when released from cares of state in England, he always hastened. The result was the first treaty of partition. When Louis found that the English and the Dutch would not consent to the Spanish dominion passing to a French prince, even if shorn of some of its territories, he agreed that it should fall to the Electoral Prince of Bavaria, provided that France received an equivalent for this concession. The price was Naples and Sicily as a separate kingdom for the Duke of Anjou, and the province of Guipuscoa in the north of Spain to be added to France. The Archduke Charles was to have the Milanese. Had the King of Spain died, as was expected, soon after the signing of this treaty, there is little doubt it would have been quietly carried out. But instead of the death of King Charles, who had long been ill, and whose death was constantly expected, the young Prince Joseph fell ill of the smallpox and died at Brussels. All the arrangements that had been made were useless, and the old difficulty returned. Negotiations began again in 1700. The claimants were now reduced to two, the Dauphin's son Philip of Anjou, and the Archduke Charles, son of the Emperor. The price of France therefore rose. England and Holland supported the claim of the Archduke Charles. It was therefore at length determined that the Archduke should be King of Spain, that Philip of Anjou should have Naples and Sicily as before, that not only Guipuscoa but also the Milanese should fall to France, and it was intended that France should exchange the latter province for Lorraine, which lay more convenient. It was natural that these treaties should produce great soreness in Spain. The Spaniards had long been at the head of a great power in Europe, and now their territories were to be divided, and their consent was not even asked. The Castilians were the proudest of all the Spaniards, and had long been the ruling class in the country. They felt it the most. The dishonour to Spain was well expressed in a famous political satire, published toward the end of Queen Anne's reign, Arbuthnot's History of John Bull, from which the popular name for an Englishman is taken. Old Lord Strutt, the King of Spain, is dying, and there assemble with measuring poles and inkhorns to divide his estate Louis Baboon, France, his neighbour John Bull, England, his tailor, and Nick Frog, Holland, his runaway servant. But the real question as to the iniquity of the partition is not settled here. The peace of Europe was more important than the honour of the Castilians, and the object of the treaty was to keep the nations at peace. The soreness in Spain, however, vented itself in anger not against Louis, but against William. The ill feeling with respect to him undoubtedly was aggravated by another matter. The Spaniards claimed for themselves the whole coast of Central America. It had occurred some years before to a visionary Scotchman named William Paterson, who had not always shown the qualities of a visionary, for he was the founder of the Bank of England, to lead a settlement in Darien on the Isthmus of Panama. He represented in glowing terms to his countrymen the splendour of the country where nature produced her fruits, little assisted by the labour of man, and the almost certain wealth which would accrue to Scotland. Paterson predicted that the whole trade with India would be diverted from its existing channels and pass across the Isthmus of Panama. The scheme created the greatest enthusiasm throughout Scotland. Everyone was anxious to obtain shares in the company which was formed. 2 ships were fitted out, and the Darien Company obtained a charter from William's representatives, the government in Scotland. The expedition failed, as it was sure to fail, seeing that the settlers knew nothing of the climate or of the country in which they were to settle. It failed utterly and entirely. Many fell victims to disease and starvation. A few escaped with their lives. This failure brought the ill will of Scotland against William. The attempt roused the ill will of England, jealous for her Indian trade, as well as the fierce anger of Spain. Moreover, the English people did not want to interfere in the affairs of Spain. They were tired of fighting, and on that account hostile to the policy of William. A House of Commons had been returned, pledged to a considerable reduction of the army, and determined to secure that in the English army there should be no foreigners. William's favourite Dutch regiment, the Blue Guards, had to leave England. There was also indignation against William, because he had granted to his Dutch friends estates that had been forfeited to the crown. The opposition to the king had indeed been carried so far that he threatened to resign the crown, and had actually written the speech with which he should resign it, a speech which is still extant. Fortunately, he never carried out this threat, but the conduct of the Spaniards, singling him out for their indignation about the partition treaties, shows that his power was not the same 3 years after as it had been when the Peace of Ryswick was signed. The Spaniards knew well the humiliation which the Parliament was inflicting on him. The ruling classes in Spain, whose one great thought was how to keep the vast monarchy together, found it necessary to select one of the 2 claimants, and selected the more powerful. There were 2 parties at the Spanish court, the larger and more earnest party in favour of the French succession, and another in favour of the House of Austria. But the French party prevailed. When the event so long expected at last took place, and King Charles died, it was found that he had recently signed a will by which he left his kingdom undivided to Philip, Duke of Anjou, the second son of the Dauphin. William was in no position to resist. Louis, bound neither by his oaths of renunciation nor by the sacredness of treaties, without hesitation permitted his grandson to accept the inheritance, and the temper in which he did so was well illustrated by the speech with which he is said to have dismissed him to take up his crown. Il n'y a plus de Pyrénées. The Pyrenees exist no longer. Philip went to Spain, where he was crowned and quietly received by the people as Philip V. It would seem as if Louis were going to have his own way, and if he had been careful neither to offend the people of England nor to alarm the Dutch, it is more than possible that there would have been no war. William and the leading statesmen of Holland might have felt indignation at the undoing of their work, and might have given their sympathies to the Archduke Charles. But they were powerless until Louis committed a series of mistakes which brought the war upon him. 1. When Philip went to Spain, his grandfather, by letters patent, reserved his right of succession to the French crown. By this, the fear of a union between the two countries was increased. 2. King Louis put French garrisons into towns of the Spanish Netherlands, showing that he regarded those towns as now so closely united with France that he might treat them as his own. He even proposed that the Netherlands should be ceded to him, as his government was so much nearer and more convenient than that of Spain. By this, the fears of the Dutch were excited. But however strongly William might feel this, the English people were still indifferent. 3. When James II, the exiled King of England, died at Saint-Germain, Louis, visiting him on his deathbed, was moved to promise that he would recognize his son as the King of England. On the death of James, his son James, usually known as the Old Pretender, was with all due formality recognized at Versailles, and the English people were at last aroused. The English ambassador was recalled from France. The French ambassador quickly received orders to leave London. The Parliament that had grudged supplies to William was dissolved. Amid the greatest excitement another was elected, giving a large majority to the friends of William, and the country in many ways was now as eager as it had previously been disinclined for war. For such an occasion as this William had waited. However much he might deplore that the peace of Europe should once more be broken, although he knew that his own health was feeble, and that he could not live much longer, the stern purpose of his life did not desert him. That purpose had been opposition to the growing power of Louis. Since the death of King Charles, he had laboured to excite resistance to France among European powers. The backwardness of the English had tied his hands, but now, through the chivalrous folly or insolence of Louis, this difficulty had been removed. The League of the European powers, known as the Grand Alliance, was revived, the objects of which were to place the Archduke Charles on the throne of Spain, and to keep down the power of France. It declared first that France was not to retain the Netherlands, nor to acquire the West Indies, and secondly, that the crown of France and Spain were never to be united. But the Grand Alliance was no sooner formed than its creator died. William had never been a strong man. He had suffered from many complaints, and was hardly ever free from asthma. His indomitable spirit had carried him through scenes of toil and fatigue which would have brought even strong men low. His restless energy and his unceasing work had at last worn him out. All his doctors told him to prepare for death, and indeed he was ready for it. "You know," he said to a friend, "that I never feared death. There have been times when I should have wished it. But now that this great new prospect is opening before me, I do wish to stay here a little longer." He was riding on his favourite horse Sorrel in Hampton Court Park, when the horse stumbled upon a molehill. The king was thrown and broke his collarbone. An illness ensued which ended in a fever, and the fever proved fatal. About the character of William III many a battle has been fought. His name has been made a cry wherewith to rouse animosities which are better left at peace. As no man is perfect, so in William's government doubtless mistakes may be found. Perhaps they deserve even a harsher name. But the service which he rendered to England is undoubted and priceless, and it was not well repaid. During his later life his years were embittered by opposition from the English, who no longer felt the pressing need of his services against Stuart tyranny. He was constantly reproached with favouring his foreign friends. Would Englishmen have thought better of him if he had left his old and faithful friends unrewarded? It is not, however, only or chiefly as an English king that William is to be judged, rather as a European statesman. As our fathers fought against Napoleon to preserve the liberties of Europe, and therewith our own, so William, from his earliest years to his deathbed, held constantly before him the one thought, how best to keep the power of France within bounds. Germany had been left so divided at the Peace of Westphalia that there was no one great state in Europe which could resist Louis. The only chance was an alliance. But for an alliance it was necessary that there should be some one to propose and maintain it, one who could humour this ally and persuade that, one who, penetrated with the greatness of the cause, could forgive petty insults, and by his own warmth make up for the coldness of others. Such an one was William. Though William died, his work lived on. The machine, it has been said, was put together on true principles, and it continued in motion, though the master workman was gone. End of section 1.